On today's episode of Boundary Breakers, I sit down with one of the most passionate, thoughtful entrepreneurs I have had the privilege of talking with. Kyle Hanslovan started his career in the U.S. Air Force, went on to work for the NSA, and while in the government, learned cybersecurity and ultimately became one of the top ethical hackers on the planet. He then started Huntress Labs, where he's raised over $200 million in venture capital and is one of the top small business cybersecurity firms in the world. This is one of the most fascinating subjects that I've spoken with people about: cybersecurity and intelligence gathering. I think you're going to enjoy this one. Boundary Breakers is brought to you by Carter & Clark. If you're comfortable with it, would love to, start off just with a quick sort of origin story, where you grew up, where you came from, family, brothers or sisters, that type of thing, just so the audience can just get an understanding of, who they're hearing from, to be able to relate. And then would love to get into as much as you can, or as much as you are willing, about some of your time with NSA, and then how you transitioned from that with Huntress Labs and the recent, what you guys do, why you do what you do, and the recent success you guys have had with fundraising and some of the black hat ethical hacking stuff you do. It's all fascinating to me. I'll help guide us through. But if those subjects are good to sort of probe into, we'll get after it.
Yeah, dude. It's one of those of, obviously, I'll never cross a boundary I can't, but I'm a big fan of hot takes. Like, I'm a huge consumer of podcast content, and there's nothing worse than being on with, listening to a guest that either isn't excited or not willing to, I don't want to hear the most mundane stuff. If I can go read, for instance, somebody's 2-minute bio, why do I want to hear 60 minutes of the same boring stuff? So, I don't mind. You can take it whatever direction you're comfortable with.
Okay.
I'm also a super casual dude, so Brandon, I'm excited about it.
Good stuff. Well, awesome, man. You're the ideal guest. I love it. All right, so Kyle, if you don't mind, could you just give us sort of a brief background, sort of where you came from, where you were born, went to school, that type of stuff?
Yeah, so I grew up on the West Coast. It was bouncing between Albany, Oregon, and Portland, Oregon, and so for me, I didn't appreciate some of that, kind of Northwest vibe until I moved away. And I don't know if my parents were on the run from the law or what it actually was, but we moved a lot, right? You can kind of divide my life into a bunch of, 8-9 year chunks. So Get me to about 10, I go from Oregon to Florida. You get me through high school, I'm a punk kid, and I'll share a little bit of that background. But when you say you're a punk kid, it's usually as a result of your environment. And for me, I have a super caring, loving, single mom, right? And so that came from we were poor, but not hungry poor. We always lived with whoever the boyfriend du jour was, right? Which means a lot of moving.
Yeah. And
it turns out when you have that, you get scrappy. And these were things that only till I started doing some retrospect. I've got some kids of my own now. They're 19, 17, and 13.
Wow.
So now that I'm looking back and I'm why is my life a little bit different than theirs? I realized, the situation was a lot different. So again, you fast forward from that lifestyle, being kind of the broke, poor kid in Florida. This is the days a lot of the audience doesn't remember, but remember dial-up internet, free AOL, floppy disks and CDs. And so for me, I firmly believe opportunity is one of those things that even though intelligence appears to be distributed fairly equally, opportunity is not. And so for me, it was always about chasing opportunity or making opportunity. And so that poor scrappy kid of me, I got into cybersecurity because I had to learn how to get on AOL for free. That wasn't the most ethical ways at times, some social engineering, some tricking people to do it. Hey, I'm AOL CEO Steve Case. Please give me your password to make sure that your account's secure. But it was never the point. I wasn't racking up somebody's credit card. It was back in the AOL days. You could only have one user logged in at a time. So I had to have somebody in multiple time zones. So no matter when I needed internet, I had to do it. Thankfully, I was also doing at this time junior ROTC. I'm a real big believer in giving back more than you take. And so for me, that opportunity to instill some of those values, junior ROTC taught me a lot about ethics. And I was a bit of a punk. And I had the opportunity to join the service. So I did. 17th birthday, I went into the Air Force. Thankfully, when they do a polygraph and background test on you or background check, they say, we're only going to ask you questions back to your 18th birthday. Being 17, that worked out really well because there was no questions. And so
Perfect.
I never had the FBI show up, nothing like that. But like those scrappy, having to do what's needed to figure out, because I wasn't going to get the opportunity given my circumstances, I didn't even appreciate it. They're probably the biggest difference between like me and even my kids' generation where they didn't have the same pressures.
Gosh, well, I love that. And I appreciate you sharing. I did not realize, but I can relate to a lot of that. So my father passed away when I was 11. I had an older brother who was 13. And so, they didn't have a single mom my entire childhood, but certainly sort of in the formative years. And not only that, I too was probably described by many as a punk, and then ended up going to the Citadel because for very similar reasons. I needed it. So, and not only that, but I was a very frequent AOL user as well. So it sounds like we actually had pretty surprisingly similar background. So I love it.
And I think it breeds character for sure. And I'm sure the next generation will have their own stories. But for me, my dad's was narcotics instead of, passing away. But I'm sure they were equally rough not having that influence. So.
Yeah. And, you said one thing that I thought was interesting about really not really realizing it while you were doing it. But in retrospect, you look back and sort of pick up on things and note some things. And it's been very similar for me, right? Not a lot of things, not having, having a single parent, being raised by a mom, there are certain things that you don't really realize. I didn't realize coming up. But as an adult with my own kids now, there's things that I see and I think, gosh, I missed that influence. If I'd had that influence, things would be a little bit different. So,
yeah. And what's funny? Like, I don't know if you feel the same, but maybe even some of the audience, right? Of sometimes the influence is not having a good influence. Like, for instance, my dad did not show me what to do, but I could learn what not to do. And so I always try to keep it like somewhat glass half full.
Yep.
My mom, by working and being such a hard worker as a single parent, she just always had to deliver. And I don't know, some people ask like, hey, where did you get it? Where do you get the grit? And I've got to imagine maybe osmosis, something about like mom's work ethic rubbed off.
And there's something, I could not agree more. I mean, two things. Number one, people ask me all the time now, like, how did you know what you wanted to do, right? Or, did you always want to grow up and be in business or be a CEO? And I always say, look, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just had to figure out what I didn't want to do. And so I made a lot of stupid decisions and did a lot of really dumb things, but looking at, I wouldn't change any of it because that was how I learned to get on the right path. But also, I think you're exactly right. I never really thought about that. There's something that's still in me very, very strongly that wants to make my mom proud for how hard she worked to get me here.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people dog on therapy. For me, it's been more like life coaching. And I had a great friend, an entrepreneur. You're talking multi-billion-dollar exit. I mean, he pulled me aside one day and he was like, I'm going to tell you a secret. Therapy has the world's worst marketing, but it's actually life coaching. And I started doing that stuff one day a week back in 2022. So, we've got a couple years of it now. And there's a lot of these things I'm just starting to appreciate that were kind of in the background. If I would have made time to maybe think about it, I could have realized it. But for me, everybody tells you, oh, hey, it must be great being a CEO. And oddly enough, I'm sure we'll get to some of that later on as we're talking. But for me, it's been probably one of the loneliest jobs I've ever had.
Amen, brother. Amen. It is extremely lonely for me as well. So I can't wait to get to that point. But I'll try to keep us on track. So joined the Air Force at 17. How'd that go?
Man, so I had good scores. And because in the Air Force, if you get good scores, you get guaranteed a job. And again, I'll date myself, but if you remember in the late 90s to early 2000s, the word cyber was something dirty you did in a chat room. It was not cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
And so I got guaranteed into a job that was, they just called it comms. And I ended up as my first duty station of all places in England. So not a bad deck of cards to be drawn, right?
Yeah,
Or not,
nice.
not a bad hand to draw. And because of like both the experience, the things that I was doing, I kind of, some people look at like bad duties or additional duties as like a punishment. I kind of did too, but it started dawning on me the more of these things that I did, the more chances it gave me to shine. And that ended up leading me to get to work on the offensive side of cybersecurity. So not like protecting and defending like I was in comms, but I got to go into the intelligence gathering. So I started that in England and I continued it all the way to Maryland, which is where NSA headquarters is. And 13 years of my life was gathering intelligence to either stop terrorist threats or to inform our national leaders about like the world's largest national security threats. It was just a super fulfilling, career in the military.
Wow, that's fascinating. So for those in the audience that may not be super familiar with the military terms, and even though it doesn't even sound all that military, I mean, so when you talk about gathering intelligence, particularly on the cyber side, help us with that. You're talking about like tapping phones and hacking emails. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I'll try to paint a clear picture. So if you think of most movies, right, when you see like a human intelligence handler, that's more like CIA. Their job is human intelligence. So like convincing people to do espionage, giving up secrets, leaking data. The other side of it is signals intelligence. And think about that being all about how you can use the internet, how you can use satellite, undersea water cable, or underwater sea cables, stuff like that. There's all kinds of ways to tap in and get signals. And let's be real, like when you're going after any type of mission like this, however you're gathering it, right? Even if it's through like Wi-Fi, tapping phones, a lot of time it's actually like my job was building what the adversary would call malware. I was giving them viruses to steal their data. What we would call it is building implants or tools, intelligence gathering tools. Perspective, right, changes a lot of things.
For sure.
But on the receiving side, they were getting malware. And then if you think about, if I could summarize my job, I wasn't there to be smash and grab. When you're talking about true national security, especially when you're talking about counterterrorism, I'm a persistent threat. I'm going to be with you everywhere you go, every step you take type opportunity. And most people don't know, but the teams that do it, in the movies, it looks like these glorified, sexy moments. They're actually very small compartmented teams that are building kind of world-class tools who are ruthlessly going after a target because kind of, it sounds corny or it sounds like maybe even trying to rally somebody's like emotional state, but like you have national security on the line. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, if you didn't do your job, someone gets blown up on the other end of it. That was really hard. And I deployed to Afghanistan. I've done fun stuff on that line. And it was both, for me, it was kind of coming of age, right? If you think about the military, they give you opportunity. Like where else would I get by the time I was 20, I had troops underneath me, became a sergeant in the military, a staff sergeant. And I think I probably had $20 million of equipment trusted me as a 20-year-old. Yeah. My son is 19. I won't trust him with lending my car,
right?
Let alone $20 million of equipment. So for me, you can imagine those opportunities and knowing that like, if I didn't use these tools, that maybe some innocent person would get hit with the vehicle-borne IED. That's an explosive in a car. That'll really wake you up in the morning and say, you need to do your job great. So for me, again, it was the right opportunity for the right maturity at the right time. I really enjoyed getting to support that mission.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So speaking of, I guess, dating us and us old school folks, so when I think about, signals intelligence, SIGINT and all that stuff, I think about the mob and the FBI and tapping John Gotti's, a wiretap on the mob's phone, right? So I think what you're talking about is, the next generation of that type of operation.
You're right.
Right?
It's not just the old school, I'm putting a clamp and listen to copper wire like back when you had, phones or pay phones and stuff.
Yeah.
You're talking really more cyber, what they call cyber now.
Right.
And that usually involves, if you think about it, it means collecting your data, collecting what you're sending over maybe a We hear these words like encryption, which means preventing someone from seeing your data, but exploiting it when you're not actually encrypting so I can see your communications. And that could be the difference. Like if you think about not just counterterrorism, which I think a lot of people can relate to, but in foreign intelligence, that, when you hear about going to a G20 summit, that's the summits where all the world powers get together.
Right.
How can we show up as a nation state, a leader across the globe, and not know what the other side is about to talk about?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about against our allies. We're cool with our allies, but true foreign powers, you better know well in advance what they're going to bring to the table. And if you don't, we're not going to stay in power as number one much longer. It is a true, if you believe in freedom and you believe in the idea of democracy, the things that like our country's built on,
yeah,
you are protecting that, or you're backsliding. You're not bringing your A game. You're sending our politicians to not be prepared to go toe to toe against somebody who, by the way, is doing the exact same thing to us as well.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. Well, so did you work more on the development of these particular tools, almost in lay terms, more, or in civilian terms? Were you trying to invent enhancements to our capabilities or technologies, like, a new program that could listen to a phone, or were you more on the operational side of things, were actually trying to get, a particular software onto a foreign leader's phone, or,
That's an awesome question, because most people don't even know that those are different jobs. And so I was really lucky. I got to span, I'll call it the myriad of 3 major jobs. You can kind of think about it as a triangle. I started as an analyst, meaning somebody was already gathering intelligence, somebody was already doing the operation, and I was just analyzing. And that's how I started. And it was a good gateway drug to kind of know what was expected. As I moved from being an IT guy, I learned how to develop, write code. And so I actually moved into development, and I was building the actual tools to gather the intelligence, which turned out to be the most technically challenging part of my job. It also set me up in the future for learning how to build software products. So that was a kind of a cool byproduct. And then when I left active duty military, which is when you're, at the job every single day, 365 days, I moved to National Guard side of the house, where my job was 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. And during that time, I actually pivoted into not only building the capabilities, but as an operator of using those. So my actual title is cyber warfare operator during that time.
Nice.
And so I'm just very lucky that I got a chance to see all, sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was one of those that taught me a lot about, not only about building things with lots of automation. If you think about those small teams, you can't go after a needle in a haystack unless you're using tons of automation. Tons of AI is the new cool buzzword, but It is part of what we did. And what's neat about it is you have to deliver valuable outcomes. And I, again, just like how I didn't know that my situation, both with like single mom and dad, and helping me grow into like a man, and a respectful adult, I didn't realize that the stuff that I was learning at NSA was teaching me a lot about setting me up for my future as an entrepreneur, being very lean, using tons of automation, delivering value that people palpably appreciate. All those things were things that during this time in my military career, I slept on, I took for granted.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's a masterclass in sort of like, how do you leverage tools, leverage technological tools to get the information that you need to get to help protect the country. That's thinking about it from that way is really interesting. Well, so where were you when 9/11 happened, and as we kicked things off in Afghanistan and Iraq? Where does that sort of fall?
Still punk kid in school. I was in a calculus class in high school.
Okay.
I was one of those nerds, really strong in math, really strong in science. And so back when we didn't have LCD TVs, right? Big old thick, it was probably a 26-inch TV that weighed 9,000 pounds,
right,
hanging from the ceiling. And that was a moment, right? I remembered my mom talking to me about Elvis Presley dying. That'll date her a little bit. And that was a big thing for her. And I could never relate, how could something grip you? And nobody got to see the first one. It was always after the fact, right? News had caught it. So all the TVs come on in the class, and I'm watching what had just went down. And then you get to see the second one live. And I was like, whoa. It's the first time that And I told you I was a punk, right?
Yeah.
Back then you could rent VHSs, right? The old school movies. And I was watching Faces of Death and these odd like things you shouldn't watch as a kid. I mean, we didn't have the internet the same way, but I
Right.
was watching this like morbid stuff, but I had never seen something like that before. And for me, it was a very clear, I was already on the path that I believed in service, not just for the military, but again, the idea of giving back more than I took. I admired the structure that a lot of military leaders were like admired from. I had a chance to meet a lot of like Vietnam vets and things like that as a kid, and I could not quite relate to it, but I knew that there was something like honorable about it.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was kind of a cauterizing moment for me of like, okay, the call to action. And within 2 years later, I was, in the military through basic training and preparing.
Gotcha. That helps. That helps with some context. So I assume that a lot of your efforts and your team's efforts were directed toward that area, right? Toward the Middle East. I mean, I have no idea. Maybe you were on a team that was Russia-based.
Yeah, the counterterrorism mission was very much in my deployment to Afghanistan. I obviously the audience, that's listening to this only in podcasts can't see it, but I'm talking about, I'm like 175 wet, right? I'm not a huge guy.
Yeah.
And I've never been a barrel-chested freedom fighter, but oddly enough, when you're intelligence, I got attached to special forces teams, which I am the opposite of an operator. And when you go do that, you get a chance to like actually see what it is on the ground and actually feel like it's one thing to sit behind a computer in the air conditioning from the US. Throw a deployment or two underneath you and all of a sudden you appreciate things a little bit different. So again, they were small deployments. Those guys were on 1 year deployments. I was doing like 4 to 6 months,
Yeah.
nowhere close to the same, but it definitely gave me appreciation. And I think that set me up a little bit too, where, it's not all about the stars and stripes. It's about a little bit of thinking through of what my life was. And I know, Brandon, like we don't have all the time in the world, but there was a moment that shocked me. So it turns out Special Forces is about, like the Green Beret team I was with, they're about intelligence gathering. They're silent professionals. They're actually some of the most admirable people I've ever worked with. But part of the job is also what they call HA, humanitarian assistance. And I remember the first chance I got as I was talking like with an interpreter and some of the folks, that I had a moment where we showed the local province and they could relate to the local province. And then I kind of zoomed out a little bit and I showed the country. And there was kind of this like, I don't think the country looks like that. And then I zoomed out even further to see like all of Europe and Middle East. And they recognized London. That's what it was. There was a place that they had heard of, but didn't know how far. And then I, again, zoomed out a little bit further and showed where the United States was. And the question was, what was all this blue in between? And when I said it was water, complete disagreement. Absolutely what I was sharing couldn't possibly be true. And that was a big moment for me. That was a moment when I realized, like, how are we going to bring like democracy, for instance, and these like Western values to a place where education, the gap is so big they couldn't understand what was fact.
Yeah.
This is the size of the globe. And for me, it made me realize that even though my military career was successful, I'd won the top cyber warfare operator at NSA. I'd just won the World Series of hacking. I, at that point, was like, it is time for me to go figure out how to use my skills to give back bigger, because there's only so many limits of what I could do in the military. And so for me, deployment not only opened my eyes against what what I would call the real heroes on the ground actually do, but it also, opened my eyes to like what my own personal goal was, kind of like I knew I wasn't going to make it if I stayed in my local town. I needed to go to the military.
Yeah.
This was just as big moment for me, or of the next chapter of, okay, it's time for me to figure out how do I go and make a difference to the greater world as a civilian, or at that time it was part-time military member.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. And look, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've had a lot of, I've had several special forces folks on here, a lot for the military, and, the whole, SSE, the sensitive site exploitation after the mission and the intelligence gathering and getting the laptops and this. I mean, it's become clear to me how critical that part of, how critical that was to our strategy, right? And so I can completely see very naturally how they would want to connect the cyber warfare apparatus with the folks on the ground. And I think, to me, that's fascinating.
You nailed it. Gathering intelligence was a big part of it, but think about like when you're bringing somebody so sensitive to a meat house, you can't possibly have anybody else that knows that you're there, let alone what you're talking about. So a big part of my job that equally was like after a raid, gathering intelligence or something like that, media exploitation is usually what we called that. It was also about like making sure the meat houses we were at weren't bugged. And so a lot of people forget intelligence gathering isn't just us versus the adversary. Sometimes it's us versus an adversary versus other intelligence apparatus. So it's not odd that you could find your meat house could also be bugged. Wow. And so it was a really collaborative where, again, these folks, proper barrel-chested freedom fighters, aren't the person that, for instance, is prepared to go and look at a spectrum analyzer to find out there is some radio frequency emitter that's gathering the same intelligence that we're taking the risk in human doing it, and they've planted some bugs. So it was, again, one of those things for me that it was just very fulfilling to get outside of outside of the air conditioning and actually enjoy, what it's actually like life on the ground.
Well, that is really, really cool. Well, all right. So you mentioned several things that I want to try to unpack, but at some point you transitioned over from active duty military to the National Security Agency. Is that right?
Yep.
And so
even when active duty, I was working for NSA, but one of the benefits of moving, NSA is actually a lot larger than most people know. But I got a chance, like the closer you get to the mothership, which is in kind of the Baltimore, Maryland area, real stuff goes down there. The best and brightest, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of best and brightest people out in the field, but I got a chance to really hone my craft and really get to work for, what they would generally consider their A-team. So it was a nice transition. That's where I had actually moved from that analyst and gathering that intelligence into the much more targeted tool development, much more targeted operations, and that skills is what fed into Huntress.
Well, that's super cool. So when you say that you got to go up there and see the best and brightest in the A-team, all I can visualize is them letting you into this NSA laboratory that has like the James Bond Q back there saying, look, take a look at all this stuff that we have. Real quick before we move on I want to talk really quickly about the World Series of Hacking and some other things, but really quick, when you got to that level, I'm curious, was there anything that they sort of read you into or introduced you to, or that you saw that you were stunned by the technology or how advanced it was, or you didn't know that we had that type of thing without talking about anything sensitive?
Yeah. I can boil this down and maybe even share with your audience of things to look for when you're in the presence of real experts. And I'll relate the physical world of that special forces environment to kind of the special forces of cybersecurity. These are folks that are masters, true experts at the basics. And the reason you have to know that, like for instance, when we were deployed, every day was a range day because you would just practice the basic motions, moving from left shoulder to right shoulder, to switching to your left shoulder to the other side, because you never know when you have to pine a corner. That same basic experience of just getting used to the foundations, it made sure that when they had to do something atypical, they never messed up on the basics. They could put all their attention onto something that was truly technical. And the equivalent happens in the offensive cybersecurity world, that they are so good at understanding the foundations, the technology, when we were going after technical targets. And to be honest, even businesses of today, like in the US, that get hacked by cyber criminals, whether for me, who is a nation state, adversary, or a cyber criminal, they tend to know your environment and the basics so much better than you. So when it comes time to react, it's just, they'll use like phrases like, smooth is slow and slow is fast, or, stuff like that. Or vice versa. In cybersecurity, they would talk about the concepts of like, if you know these foundations, that when you run into a real hurdle, you can dedicate all your expertise on the problems that are truly worth your intelligence and not the ones that are just basic. And so that love and appreciation for distilling problems to be that simple, again, that's stuff that I didn't even know I should be looking at people who are the experts. Because when I actually got to see behind the curtain, I was expecting, Q from James Bond and all the gadgets.
Right.
But it turned out even like, again, those silent professionals I mentioned, a lot of these guys by this time were deaf. Their ear, hearing was blown out from, just a career of service, but they were experts at the basics. And that's what made them the A-team of their environment. And I would just challenge anybody who's looking for opportunity. It's kind of like being in a goldfish bowl, right? As a goldfish, you're only going to grow to the size of your environment. And sometimes I ended up looking in hindsight and realized like, oh, I was in an environment that was really healthy to my growth, but I didn't appreciate it because it didn't look sexy. It was just experts at the basics. And so that, again, that's one of those things that as a kid growing up now, I've moved from maybe the third version, as I mentioned, 9 years in Oregon, 9 years in Florida, 9 years in England. I'm now in Maryland, getting ready to do the next 9 years. And that part of my life was just all about mastering the basics. So when it came time to do the hard stuff, I could rise to any occasion because I just knew the simple stuff.
God, that's so insightful.
It's not sexy though, right?
No,
You can't make a Matrix movie on something that's like, I know Kung Fu. It's like, I know how to breathe. Like, you don't think about it, but that matters.
But no, I mean, it's, and I've heard it so many times. I think you're exactly right. The whole slowest move, smoothest fast. I mean, there's a Delta Force, a retired Delta Force guy named Brent Turner who was asked about, when you go to these crazy things, aren't you scared or don't you have fear? And he talks about how, look, we've done this so many thousands of times that it's muscle memory. But he also said something that I thought was fascinating that I'll never forget. He said, I would get scared occasionally, but I would just say to myself, fear is an emotion and emotions can be controlled. Fear is an emotion and emotions can be controlled. And anyway, it was just insightful to me and to your point that I think the average person like me, right, just doesn't understand how many tens of thousands of hours are spent on the basics to become so comfortable in those crazy environments that it can be a little bit hard for us to imagine. And so
I try to make it though more relatable. Like I did enough stalking, Brandon, ahead of time on about you and about the company. I have no doubt you've reached your kind of pinnacle of where you're at a company because you have just mastered. That, for instance, when surveying, the mistakes that can happen. When calibration fails. The basics on this end, and as a result, when you get something really crazy, you're just so used to taking care of what would usually trip everybody else up. And that's the stuff that I try to get a lot of people, especially aspiring entrepreneurs, out of their head. Like, you might not be a special forces operator. Neither am I, by the way. They reminded me every day. But I did have things that I was good at. I did have things that I was exceptional. And it turns out, like, once you come to terms that I am good at this, I'm an expert at this, that for me helped me get myself in control. Like, I wasn't always a good presenter. I wasn't always a good trainer. And as an entrepreneur, especially one that has to raise venture capital, if you don't know finances and you can't speak, you are not going to go very far.
Yeah.
But because I had done these other things, I could get out of my head and just say, wait, I deployed with special forces operators. I worked at the pinnacle of this. Yeah, at times I was scared, but emotion can be controlled.
Right.
So yeah, you're nailing it on that. And yeah, not all of us are crazy. Not all of us have this heroic type background, but I would argue I'm telling the best parts of mine now.
Right.
There were 16 years of service that were also hurry up and wait and boring stuff too.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but I just think that's gold because a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs, aspiring leaders, a lot of their question is, well, so what do I do? Like, what should I be doing? Right? Like, what steps do I take? How do I get better? And it's not always that obvious. But to your point, become a master at whatever it is that whatever environment you find yourself in to try to become the best, or whatever it is that you love to do, and that you don't necessarily have to do something exceptional or have a special gadget from Q, but you have to be a master of the basics, right?
Yeah, I think also building time to think about a goal. And it might, as a kid, right, there was no goal from 0 to 9. It was probably like play, have fun, stay alive.
Right, yeah. Don't go to jail.
No, from the next chunk of 9 years, it was give myself more opportunity. I knew I was missing. And I made time as a kid, even as a kid, to say, what do I need to do? Next round, because by the way, I had 2 kids when I was in England, right? And I had them young. My oldest was born 1 week before my 19th birthday. So to go through all that with little kids too, and that changed my new goal. It was learn to become a parent, provide financial stability, become the best at my craft was the next 9 years. And those aren't super sexy. They're not changing the world. But because I was making the time to set out for a goal, it allowed me then the next set was, okay, now that I've mastered my craft, how do I make a difference to the underrepresented of the world? And that was it, right? It was one of those things. It wasn't make money. If you're chasing money, like money comes. It's the probably the easiest part of all of it. It's the, do you really have the fire in you? And then the accountability. So for me, I would, highly encourage, become an expert at it, but make the time for yourself. Make the, and it doesn't have to be something lofty. Sometime I don't think I ever sat back on year one and was like, 9 years from now, I'm going to win the World Series of hacking. I just knew I wanted to be an expert at my craft. That was it. Yeah. And that came as a result.
For sure. That's extremely insightful. And I think, I've fallen victim to it as well. If you're chasing money, or I feel like if you fall in love with the goal or fall in love with the result, right? Then you could end up going sideways. But if you're trying it, all you can do is you just want to make a whole lot of money, you're going to struggle. But like you said, the money is a symptom of being great at something else. So what is the World Series of hacking? Is that still around? I mean, obviously it sounds like a huge deal.
Yeah. So none of the hackers of the world would actually call it that. Sometimes about communicating is making it things that are very relatable.
Gotcha.
And the World Series, people understand sports. It turns out all the, hackers get together for Hacker Summer Camp in Las Vegas. It's about a week that has a major cybersecurity conference called Black Hat for shady hackers, and the following is a lot more edgy of a conference called DEF CON. And so what happens is about 1,000 teams worldwide compete in a qualifications process. And usually the top 20 teams get selected to face off against each other in Vegas at DEF CON. And like the kids game Capture the Flag, where you're trying to steal a flag, get it back to your base?
Sure.
So this game is very similar to that. It's you have to hack into somebody else, steal their flag that is constantly changing. Every minute or so it changes, and you take it. And when you take it, you submit it to the judges and you show them I've stolen their flag. And you're 20 teams that are going against it, but it's so much more than that, because you're not just hacking something that is, well known to be vulnerable. These are all custom things. None of this software exists in real life. So you can practice the foundations and the basics. So when you get this opportunity to prove yourself, you've already know those basics and you can perform. And so notice how these segued in. And I definitely did not know I was learning this, and it goes for 72 hours straight. The real teams that play to win, you don't sleep roughly for 3 days. And you have people, by the way, their support. Like we had folks there that were on shower schedule, because turns out a bunch of pasty computer nerds get pretty stinky.
Yeah.
You had people that were like chow runners, people bringing food because you're not taking care of yourself for 72 hours. And
wow,
it's nerdy. But for me, that was a big accomplishment of because everybody who makes it there, whether they're from academia or most of the people there have some affiliation to foreign intelligence gatherings. So we're there, we knew we were a team. We knew who the Russian team was. We knew who the 2 Chinese teams were. One of the schools was the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, but they didn't do advanced science and technology. It was a cover for intelligence.
Yeah.
It's always fun when when you're playing at that level where everybody respects each other. And so for me, again, that was kind of a pinnacle that got me from, if I mentioned these years of my life, it was kind of the beginning of the end of that chapter for me of, okay, I did it.
Yeah.
And so anyways, it was a blast. It's one of those things that for people in cybersecurity, that's your thing. And it still goes to this day. But I'm willing to bet, I've seen firemen, right, who go out there and they have their own fireman competitions where they have teams of how quick they can ascend the ladder, pull the ladder up, right? Usually even car, enthusiasts. There's mechanics, conferences of who can put the most thrust and horsepower to a car. I just challenge for people, whatever their passion is, find that and surround yourselves with, again, an environment that will allow you to grow to your best potential. And I bet you when you go and look at it and peel back the layers, these people will tell you, I mastered the basics so I can perform against the hard stuff when that, adversity faces me. So
That's incredible. That's incredible. Is the ethical hacking world, is it a fairly small community, small world like a lot of other?
it's bigger now. Like when I grew up, it was not popular to be a hacker. Now my kids like brag to their friends, like, my dad's a hacker, and like I get high fives and stuff. But I don't know about you, but like I'd get my butt kicked occasionally for being the hacker guy, right? It wasn't the coolest thing to be. And so, nowadays it's a little bit cooler, especially because, you can come out of college and land $100,000 job, right? That makes it real cool when you can do nerdy stuff and get paid.
Yeah, for sure.
So I will say it's bigger. And what's really neat about it is kind of like most communities, they really bonded together strong in cybersecurity to kind of, I know everybody says that fail fast, fail often. You know what? You actually go a lot further and faster if you just don't fail. And that's what the cybersecurity community did really well. These kind of like, graybeards that would come down from the mountain and tell you like their, sage advice. They kind of laid the foundation for people like me to stand on their shoulders and like not hit the same failures. And so like, I don't know if you had the equivalent in your career, but a lot of like, there's no way I got to where I was without like advice. And the advice that was good was usually, hey, what to do. But the advice that was great was like, don't do this.
Absolutely. I always, tell my team, look, we got to find somebody that's made this mistake before, right? And my goodness, I mean, I'm still a nobody, but I would be probably, destitute on the street if it wasn't for my mentors and folks that have helped sort of keep me between the guardrails and yeah, look, a mistake is one of the greatest blessings that we have, right? Because especially if you share it with somebody else, because hopefully you can help somebody else not.
Yeah, that goes back. Notice again that giving back more than you take.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us actually believe in that, but don't necessarily like. You got to make time for yourself to figure out, why am I doing what am I doing? Why? Because after, like, as a hacker, why did I choose to present my research? Well, some of it, I've got ego like everybody. It's when it's over-rotated, it gets to be a problem. For me, though, it was the combination of being recognized for my research, but also passing that to other people so they could take that baton to the next level. And that turned out, that was a big part of like my like even desire to create a company. It was about elevating a community, right? And doing it through education. And that turned out, that was a real big like part of it. Not only like gave me the dopamine hit to feel good about showing my expertise,
right?
But the real lasting effect was having somebody randomly come up and said, I didn't have to touch the hot stove because you told me how you touched it before.
Yeah.
That's winning.
For sure. No, that's good stuff. That's really good stuff. So you basically went to school in the military, NSA, proved yourself and showed yourself and the world that, you were among the top on the planet in your chosen craft. And then you decided at some point that you were going to start Huntress Labs. Walk us through that thought process and what the goal was there.
The part I'd highlight as I get ready to, dive into Huntress story is, you mentioned like I learned the lessons, but like a lot of people will get down on themselves because they didn't go straight to college. Like neither did I, right? 17. And then I spent like 8+ years at University of Maryland trying to do like overseas training to get a degree. Like I didn't take the normal path, but I still ended up what most people would call success. And so at Huntress, I finally had the confidence that I wasn't going to let perfect be the enemy of good. I didn't have to have the perfect degree. I didn't have to go straight to an Ivy League school to still be, among the best. I had to have the passion. I had to have, again, accountability. If I didn't keep myself accountable, I would have fallen off over and over, which I did. But what was nice is it turns after about like 10 years for me of doing that offensive side, I started asking like, all right, nobody's ever stopped me from hacking into their network. Should I probably be using my skills to raise that bar, right? It's, it's kind of like, I bet like the Patriots, right, in U.S. football probably felt that way after becoming a dynasty team and winning over and over. There was probably some folks that were like, should I be using these skills for other purposes, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying anybody quit and retire, but for me, it was okay, I needed the next challenge. And I wasn't really prepared for it, but I also wasn't intimidated like I was for my next challenges. So what I mean by that, I curated success. I proved I could escape, the broke life to get in the military. I proved I could succeed in the military to get the recognition. I proved I could, succeed with these skills. So it gave me each step a little bit more confidence to find like the great and not like really focus on the negative. And I said, okay, while everybody else out there is doing cybersecurity and they're doing it for all the big enterprises, all the big banks, my mom, again, was an accountant and a small business owner. And I thought, like, even if my mom wanted to, there's no amount of budget she could have to be able to afford me. And say, for instance, somebody gave me like that money to go work for my mom. I didn't want to work for a small business that way. I wanted to do good, but there's nothing sexy about working for a small business. And so I realized, what if I could bring those experts to these small businesses that they could never afford and never reach, even if they wanted to, at the price of a product? And that's where I used those skills in software development that I picked up earlier. I brought two co-founders that came from a similar background. One was an academic at a University of Maryland that did, offensive cyber at NSA. The other one was a Navy veteran. And the three of us got together and said, we're going to go and give cybersecurity to the 99%, referring to the businesses that fall below that enterprise poverty line.
Right.
And that's like the backbone of the world's economies.
Absolutely.
They're all the smallest businesses and medium-sized businesses that power these. And so for me, I was feeling riled up. What I didn't realize, though, is even though I felt good and I needed to have that positivity, I didn't realize how many of my same mentors that propped me up, they weren't going to tear me down, but they were honest to me, Brandon. I don't know if you've ever got that type of good feedback where someone has to like level you out. Like I had opportunity to go to work for big business, right? I could go work for banks or Google or something like that. And I was like, no, I'm going to start my own business. And they're like, Kyle, you got a guaranteed thing here at a job someone's going to want to do. And I don't know what got me through. I mean, for you, did you have an equivalent? What got you through to the point that finally convinced you that you wanted to be a founder or start your own thing?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And so I fell victim to the traditional teachings that at least from our generation, the parents, kept repeating, like, if you go to college, and if you go to college, you can get a chance to become a professional. If you could be a professional, you could make a great life for yourself, retire, and get a gold watch, right? So I ended up going to law school and started practicing law and was miserable, absolutely miserable, and I hated it. And so I don't want to get too much off on me, but I was looking at myself in the mirror saying, I was making a ton of money very young. I was like, I hate this, and I refuse to just hate what I do just for money. And so I went to go build something. And I got slapped in the face.
That must be it too, because again, the reason I asked you is I haven't figured out myself of what caused me to do something so crazy. But I do think it is not wanting to settle. Like I never hated the military, but I hated not having control and feeling like my potential was limited.
Yeah, exactly.
Not being able to go out and reach what I thought was the real problems at my skills, and it kind of muted all those other. I mean, even again, you've heard throughout this, my mom being one of my biggest believers.
Yeah.
She was like, Kyle, you are missing the opportunity. Like, why don't you at least, if you're going to go build a company, protect the big companies that can pay you, not these small ones. But I was so dead set on that, like trying to help protect the underrepresented, the underprotected. And I don't know if that came from like feeling like an underdog or whatever, or just wanting the challenge. But
well, I love that you asked that question. And by the way, my mom cried when I told her I wasn't practicing law, but she was so proud that, she had a lawyer. My brother's a doctor, right? So she will tell anybody that'll listen, I got a doctorate, a lawyer. But this is one of the questions it's one of the reasons for this podcast, right? I'm so fascinated and curious. What is it that why do some people have this just insane drive that despite failure, despite everybody they know telling them don't do it, there's something in them that just wants to keep going and keep pushing. And, after interviewing a bunch of folks, I don't have the answer, but I at least this point believe that for whatever it is, there's some type of fire that is in some people.
I use the word conviction. I don't know what it is, but there's something. And what's beautiful is not everybody's conviction has to be the same thing.
Right.
Your conviction can be, I want to be the best individual contributor and never go into any management whatsoever. That's cool too.
Exactly.
Chase what you're hungry for. And I don't know why. Maybe it's got to be something personality. I think there was some for me of wanting to prove I could do it. I think I felt like I was ashamed of not going to college immediately, only after. During the time it made sense, but I definitely felt ashamed of peers who had done the more traditional route. And I think there was some of me needing to prove it, but I'm only now, and sometimes I think you can only see it in hindsight, do I realize just follow what makes a difference that leaves the world in a little bit better place and helps you take care of your bills. You can't usually do one without the other.
Right.
And so for me, I sometimes get really hungry entrepreneurs or really convicted people asking me, should I start that company? And with a couple questions, I'm usually able to say do you want to learn the administrative and business and finance side? No, I hate that side. Do you want to be dedicated and held responsible for all this overhead? No, wouldn't want to do that either. And I'm usually able to say I think you're convicted, but I think you've probably fallen trapped to the same thing that I think you were describing of. Everybody's told you got to go to school. You got to become a manager to be successful. You got to start your own business. And to be very frank, that's not where you find happiness. And if you're not happy, you are not going to crush work. You are not going to make a difference. And so for me, I think I wish, and even if somebody shook me, I wouldn't have listened, to be honest. So I don't expect the audience to either. But just knowing you are enough and your convictions are enough and it doesn't have to look like everybody else's, I'll be real. I have right now the financial security and stability most people would fight and kill for. My kids don't even have a life that they can relate to mine. We're only one generation apart. My kids can't understand my life. Even with all the positive I have, I probably would not found this company again. Even with the difference I've made, I love it. It's passionate. But what people don't tell you that comes with some of the success, it's just like everything. It's a push and pull. I went through a divorce about 2 years ago and it affected the kids. It obviously affected me. You hear and start doing the math on going into therapy, right? You can see how this adds up. And I just think this is the stuff of what makes people successful is when they're most passionate. And to be very frank, kudos for those of you who want to go and create a company or want to run a nonprofit. But I wouldn't be where I'm at without right hands across the board who are just I want to help Kyle achieve his stuff. And there is nothing about that is, shameful. So anyways, I'll get off that soapbox, but no, I do wish somebody would have told me that was okay and I would have listened to it as a kid. Agreed.
I've got a book full of things that I make sure. I've got 5 kids, and to make sure that I tell my kids that no one ever told me, or maybe they did, I just didn't listen.
That would be me. I didn't listen.
But most likely me as well. But look, everything that you just said, I could not agree more. I think I think every kid in this country should hear what you just said. And in particular, this whole idea, now that I'm old enough to understand, this whole idea of here's what all of these other people did to be what they consider successful. And so therefore, that's what you should also do. I think that is almost stealing from our children. I think that, that congratulations for them. I'm happy for them. That's fantastic. But why does that mean that I need to go into that same pattern? How about I find what I'm passionate about and blaze my own trail and create my own definitions, and what is success for me may not be what is success for them. So I love where your head is and how your outlook on all of this, and your insight.
These are fairly new revelations that sometimes you can only see hindsight when it's 2020 when it is hindsight. And I got interviewed. I got lucky enough. I snagged one of those 40 under 40 awards, super prestigious.
Yeah.
I felt great for my acknowledgement. And they interviewed me, and I don't know if I was just in a moment. And they said, "What would you tell somebody else that is striving to have the achievement you have?" And I said, it comes at giving up being a good dad or a good parent or a good partner for 5 years of your life. Are you willing to trade that? And the journalist looked at me shocked.
Really?
That was not the answer. And they said, we're going to go on record with that. I said, I appreciate it if you do. And it was one of those, you can find it out there. There was a couple of these hot takes. And the reason I said it that way is I don't know. I don't know it, but in that moment, it was real. I've lost, like, do the math on the timeline. My kids who are 19, 17, and 13, they were 5, 9, and 11 when I founded this. Those are the greatest years of my kids' life gone. There's no money, there's no set happiness that brings it back. And I think even though I wouldn't have been able to hear, Kyle, hey, you're enough, you don't need to do these things. Remember how I made that comment about, like, invest in yourself to think through what your goals are? I think if somebody would have sat me down and said, Kyle, you need to come to terms with yourself. What is enough? When is enough is enough? And if I would have taken the time, like, I grew up fairly broke, so I was pretty happy financially shortly after leaving the military. I had everything I needed financially, but I got caught up in this is what the next step. And I never look back, and, like, now that I have it, one of my biggest goals is, like, philanthropy and giving it away, right? I mean, how do I give other people the opportunity that I wasn't afforded? That's a big part of, like, for me. And I just don't think I ever came to terms that, like, enough was enough a long time ago.
That's interesting. So what I hear you saying is it wasn't necessarily clear to you everything that you'd have to sacrifice to get what you thought you wanted.
Yeah, everybody tells the overnight success stories, but they don't talk about the toll. You run into the amount of founders. There's plenty of founders who make it through and find work-life balance. But I tend to learn, like, now that I'm real and I have folks that are also, I've built multi-billion-dollar companies. Everybody's got a story. This is how I missed, my mom. I couldn't get back in time because of a business thing and she passed. This is how I missed out on these birthdays because I chose a business trip instead. I had a deal that I couldn't close, so I completely missed. And this was my daughter's last year that she believed in Santa Claus or something like that. And she never, I never got it because I worked through, Christmas Eve and I never got that moment.
Yeah.
Like, all these things are stuff, like, nobody talks about. And I just don't get it. I think it's because we all want to position ourselves as, like, I'm the alpha, right? Alpha woman, alpha male, alpha whatever. But, like, what's truly being alpha is, like, being content and happy with yourself.
Yep.
And don't get me wrong. If you want to chase it, you want to be an influencer, you want to go do it.
Yeah.
But it turns out there is so much, on the other side of that coin that it might cost you that I just don't think anybody makes you think about what you're actually trading.
I agree. I also think if there was some way we could do a poll or ask a question and be guaranteed an honest answer, and you went and asked a lot of these successful people, what is it that you really want versus what is it that you think that society wants of you, or that you think that you're doing because that's what you're supposed to do, or because it's going to look like other people might think, or how it might look. Look, I've done so many things in my life that I didn't really want to do that, but I wanted others to see me have done it.
Yeah, that's that darn ego, right? You
Absolutely.
need that stroke a little bit. And you know what I didn't realize, because so you and I, it's crazy, Brandon, how much, like, we've got overlap in background, what we're feeling on this end. But I don't think I thought through, like, some of these things weren't ifs, they were whens. And if I would have thought through, like, wait, could I have had that success after my kids no longer want to talk to me, which usually happens at about, like, 15, 16 when they start driving. They're too cool. Yeah, they'll come for dinner.
Yeah.
But life changes. You can find all kinds of data that shows how much you spend with your kids, or how much you spend even with your parents versus when you move out, how much it drops off. Why could you have not found that success later? And I asked myself that later. Like, I am passionate. I am so proud of the difference I've made to the small and mid-sized business. I feel like I've elevated cybersecurity to a whole different level. Could I have done that and felt just as good after? Why didn't I consider the prioritization, the timing, not if I'm going to do it, but when I'm going to do it? And so, anyways, I just think that, like, if you can't tell, I've got a lot of regret that's coming out somehow in this podcast, but a lot of it still, at the end of the day, I am proud of what I've done. I just wish I would have thought about the timing differently and also even to the point of like, how much, to what extreme, right? Boundaries, I guess, is what probably somebody in therapy would say.
Yeah.
Did you spend the time to build yourself boundaries?
Yeah. Well, the great thing, or the glass half full about, you said the regrets coming out, you don't know why. Somebody is going to listen to this and take something from it, right? And they're going to say, oh gosh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Or I'm so glad he said that because I was going to do that. And maybe I'll put it off or do something different. And so another one of the weird things about this world is like, one person's regrets or somebody else's blessings, just like the lessons, right? From our mentors. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I want to learn a little bit more about Huntress and exactly how you solved that.
So I mean, obviously the podcast is called Boundary Breakers for a reason, right? And what's nice, I think, about what we've just set up is you can still break boundaries in many, many ways. I would actually, hopefully, my biggest inspiration I've left here is not just don't do it. Like, that's not it at all. I've loved every bit. My job has actually been one that I was passionate about. And I cherish my time with younger folks, especially like my kids being like high schoolers, because they're a little bit more receptible. Gen Z, for all the things that a lot of people believe Gen Z, is, I tend to believe they actually just know how to communicate their expectations. And it might be not the greatest ways. They haven't learned it because, let's be real, a lot of Gen Z is still very, very young. They know what they're worth and they know what they won't tolerate. And that comes with all kinds of pros and all kinds of cons. Sometimes they need to probably dial it back. But where I'm going with this whole thing is when it came time for me to do in Huntress, I knew there was a real problem. And I think regardless of whether I waited a year or not a year, some of the biggest motivation I got out of this whole thing was I need to move fast. And I actually think that's what I'm most proud of. And for Huntress, I probably waited too long in the military to jump in. Part of me says, couldn't I have jumped out maybe after, 10 years of the service between National Guard and started it instead of waiting for like 16 years? And I think in some ways that would have, really helped me lit the fire. There's people that are in need. So go to the early days of Huntress. I am lit up. I am a hacker. I did not know how I was going to help the SMB. Turns out I had no acumen on sales, no acumen on marketing, definitely didn't know anything about finances. You can't, by the way, raise $200 million like I have if you don't learn finances. So I knew I had some gaps, but what lit me up and what pressed me to break the boundaries was urgency. And so even though a lot of the stuff that I've said has sounded like don't do it, I would actually challenge maybe the right thing when you do inventory and priorities is maybe you need to move faster. Don't settle for doing something that takes 10 years when you can get it accomplished in 4. And so for me, coming in and looking at the SMBs, the small and mid-sized businesses, according to our last census, there's 33 million, by the way, of SMBs in the world, or not in the world, in the US alone. Some of those are one-person companies. But where I'm going with that is I knew if I didn't get really creative to find a way to do that one-to-many relationship, like I couldn't knock on 33 million doors. That would not work. And so Brandon, for me, like part of my disruption wasn't just doing cool cybersecurity. I had to figure out how to go to market. I had to figure out what people could actually pay for. And it turns out like my addiction to listening to learning on podcasts paid off big time when I started my company, because some of the advice I was given is go to these people that you think you want $1 from their pocket and just listen. Ask a question, a leading question, and then shut the heck up and listen. And they'll tell you their pain points. And it turns out the pain points I thought they were having were not the pain points.
Really?
Even some of these businesses who I was trying to sell cybersecurity to, they were like, Kyle, I don't even have an IT department, let alone a cybersecurity department. So Brandon, some of the hardest lessons I ended up learning about my business of protecting kind of that 99% was how to even reach them. Turns out a lot of these small businesses that I was talking to, they outsource their IT. And once I figured out that I could go to that IT outsourcer, that was the right person. That was the person who understood the pain point. That's the person who would give me $1 from their budget. And that lesson of just zipping my lips after asking a question and just continuing to take notes, ask them about nuance, and then just listen. allowed me to really, I think I could say that was failing. I was just failing quick, right? I was learning, I was pushing new boundaries. But what was nice is once I learned it was an IT outsourcer or a managed service provider is what they call themselves now. I then went to them and I asked the same questions. And they told me how to build product. They told me how to, how to charge for it. They told me what their budget was like. And so if I could give anybody advice that's considering the entrepreneur stuff, whether it's an app, whether it's a new social media site, but even if it's something that's more, in the physical world, if you're providing pool services, go learn what the pain points are. Figure out, should you actually build a business that goes in here? If you're getting into construction, what are you truly going to do better? And if it's not 10 times better, 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, should you be wasting your life? Or should you really go after something that's truly innovative? And for me, I lost a little bit of it by, you heard some of that regret creep into my conversation here earlier because I don't think I moved faster in the beginning. And if I could give any of your audience, advice on breaking boundaries, it's move fast, listen, find the real pain points, because you won't break boundaries at that point. You'll struggle to break ground, let alone a boundary, right? And I think this podcast is all about disrupting things. So that's the advice I'd give to your audience.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And Kyle, I do want to say one thing. What I haven't heard, I've heard a lot of sincerity and honesty and transparency, but I haven't really heard you say, don't do it. Right? I mean, I know you've talked about regret, but what I've heard, what I've taken from it, and I've learned a lot in the last hour, is ask yourself if you want it. And if you want it, be thoughtful about why you're doing it and how you should do it, and do it your way instead of because this is what I'm supposed to do or because somebody else. And
you're nailing it, right? Could you imagine if you didn't follow your conviction? That just seems like a super unhappy life. Yeah. You get one of them.
Right.
And so I would never, and even with me, I've got regrets on how I did it, but not for a single second did I say don't do it.
Right.
I just said the timing, the prioritization, how I did it. Did I move fast enough? But for me, like when right, or you feel, and you make the time to learn what you think you're here for, again, that conviction, like you got to do it. If not, like in a blink of an eye, I've gone 20 plus years since I joined the military. That's just happened so quick. And I think in hindsight, like if you're not doing what you love, like I'm pretty sure that's what we're actually here for. Do what we're passionate about, leave things better than we found it, give back more than we take, be a good person. That's a pretty satisfying life to me. I know everybody's different, but that for me was my North Star. And, I bet a lot of the audience would relate to those similar principles.
For sure. And just one other just general or last comment. I'm fascinated by your story, what you've done, how you think about what you've done, and how you're moving forward in general. And what I find really interesting is both of us being critiquing some of the things we've done in retrospect, I think is probably just yet another symptom of this sort of desire to continue to improve or to see, like, we want to get better. We want to do it this way or that way, or it's not quite good enough. And, you don't raise $200 million for a company that you started if you aren't unbelievably, gifted across all areas and have, again, my audience is going to think, they're going to get sick of me saying this, but this unusual fire or, what did you call it? Conviction.
Yeah, the conviction, right?
And yours burns bright and it's inspiring to me and to hopefully, anybody that watches or hears this. And man, I just think that you're just such a perfect example of there's so many stories and there's so many lessons and there's so much experience that really thoughtful, gifted people have. And we're stealing from other people if we don't share it,
Yeah, that selfishness, right? If you're not actually giving back, like, why hoard it?
Yeah. Well, so last question, and you have been so generous with your time, and I appreciate it. Actually, I lied. Second to last question. The last one is really short, though. What is it? Where do you think this desire to give back and to give to people that, you mentioned philanthropy, give away the money that you have, you've gotten up to this point. What is it that you think drives that or creates that desire?
Even the most selfish people I've ever met in my life, which I've had a couple that I've come across, they always have I've rarely met a bad person. They usually always have something to give back. I think that's actually something of humans and how we survived for so long was through community, right? We banded together. We're a social creature. And so I think some of this is just probably most people have it. They might not be listening to it. But the part for me is when you didn't have it early on, I've learned to appreciate it. I came through a period of my life too where I actually took it for granted. And I think I'm coming full circle enough to realize oh, I've got it now and it's time to be able to give it back. So for me, I've got 3 major core values that we run the company by, and they're simple. The first one is own it. That's about me holding myself accountable, but it's also about holding other people to a higher standard. So that's a big one for me of my next higher standard is how do I give back, and how I'm holding your own audience accountable is what are you doing to give back? How are you showcasing your successes? That's cool for, the gram. That's cool for TikTok. But how are you showcasing your failures so we can grow together? The next one, by the way, is elevate it. I believe we all exist to literally educate and support the success, not just of ourselves, but all. Embrace challenges, push each other's boundaries, not just yourself, right? And put a team first. And the last part of it is, I love this phrase, send it, right? In the military, when they'd send off a rocket, send it. When we would throw malware, we would say, send it. And that's just about relentlessly pursuing not just risks, but the experimentation that goes with it. You don't always know the right way. You don't always know who the right perfect person is, but just deal with what the cards you've been given and send it, right? Challenge the conventions, try to deliver outcomes, and kind of embrace these different views and move forward together. So again, these things, I don't know where they came from. I don't know what about my career made some of this better than others, but what I have been doing well is even when I don't fully understand how I got there, I'm making the time to look at myself and say, how did I go from 18 to 28, from 28 to 38? Now I'm on the next part of the journey, right? From 38 to 48. And I'm asking, okay, what can I learn from that 10-year chunk? And what can I pass on? And what's my next goal? So again, I wish I had all the answers. I'm on the same journey. I put my pants on just like the audience, one leg at a time. And it's one of these things that I hope that at least some of it, even if I don't know all the answers, Brandon, on how I got here, I have been able to look backwards. I have been able to appreciate what I've been given. I've been able to acknowledge when I took it for granted. And I hope that just a little bit of this resonates with the audience.
Absolutely. That's amazing. That's a hell of an answer. Well, so if the audience wants to know a little bit more about Huntress and potentially whether it could be used in their business or in somebody's business or somebody that they know, where should they go? Where would you direct them?
Yeah, the simple answer is huntress.com.
Okay.
And for your audience, especially the grinders, the hustlers, the promoters out there, notice what I did in this podcast, right? The whole time I talked about why, what fires me up. Simon Sinek's got a whole book on starting with why. And the end result is it turns out if you're passionate and people align with what you're doing, they're more likely to follow a call to action of if you're interested, cybersecurity is a major thing, you hit up huntress.com, and that's all I got to say on that end. And I would challenge, the audience to do the same. It's not about putting the big billboard out. It's not about driving the fancy car. It's about showing people what you're passionate about. And it turns out when you're aligned with someone and why they do it, you want to jump on board. So Brandon, obviously I appreciate you giving me the chance for that call to action, but
Absolutely.
We're all in the same fight together, right?
For
Some
sure.
people are passionate about, landscaping and, making sure that we can, build buildings that stay up.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing, on my end, I just want to wreck hackers every day.
I love it. Wreck hackers. I love it. Well, is there anything that we, this was an amazing discussion. One of the best that I've had. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you were hoping that we would get a chance to, or that you wanted to say?
No, and I think even, you and I have gone off on a lot of tangents. I think you summarized it. You called a lot of it about transparency. You and I could probably do a podcast alone on just like, what does modern versions of transparency look like?
Yeah.
But maybe we save that for another episode or something along those lines.
Well, I was just going to say, if you would be willing, I mean, I would have you on as many times as you were willing, because I think, it's just, I think we think a lot alike and we share similar background, similar sort of outlook. I'd love it if you give the audience another hour and I could think about a subject, interesting subject, and see if you have any interest in it. But
yeah, let's go and break some boundaries.
Love it. I love it. Well, Kyle, thank you so much. Appreciate you. Appreciate your story. Wish you the best. Everyone's going to go to huntress.com and check it out.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
All right, bud. Take care. Don't forget, everybody, you can find Boundary Breakers in a lot of places. You can watch our episodes on the Boundary Breakers YouTube channel, or you can listen to each podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other major podcasting platforms. Thanks for listening.